Bonjour and welcome back to the history of the United States since 1877. Today might be the day to shed a tear because that will be the last lecture in our class. But we'll end on a high note. We will cover the modern conservative movement from Ronald Reagan in the 1980s to Donald Trump in 2020, which is a fascinating topic, whether you're a conservative or liberal, because it delves into hot-button issues that are still very much in the news. One of the main goals of this course has been to teach you recent political history so that you can become an informed voter. Well, that's exactly what we will do today. Be aware, however, that historians are not comfortable dealing with very recent events. We haven't had the time to look at all the evidence yet because some of it is, still classified. Also, political passions have not cooled yet, so there is a higher risk of bias. So think of this lecture as a work in progress. When I first started teaching U.S. history in college, Bill Clinton was still president. So that's a lecture I've had to update many times over the years, and I will update it again in the future. We have 4 slides on the menu. The first will look at the source of the conservatives' anger, basically everything that was wrong with the 60s, according to conservatives. The second slide will cover the modern conservative agenda, i.e. what conservatives hoped to achieve when in power. And then we'll switch to a chronological approach. The third will look at what conservatives did when they reached power in the 80s and 90s, especially under Ronald Reagan. And the fourth slide will take the story to the 21st century, i.e. George Bush and Donald Trump. I'm taping this in the spring of 2021, shortly after Trump left office. Let's start with our first item, the rebirth of the conservative movement in the 1970s, what I call the Conservative Backlash. The 1960s, which we studied in the previous section, had been a period of triumphant liberalism. The goals of liberals like Lyndon Johnson had been to solve all of society's ills through government action, whether it's inequality between blacks and whites through the Civil Rights Act, or the poverty gap through the War on Poverty, or the gaps between women and men through the feminist movement. In many ways, this agenda has continued to define the Democratic Party ever since. Our current president, Joe Biden, also seeks to defend minorities, the poor, and women. However, progressive achievements in the 1960s were a cup half full, half empty kind of situation. A lot improved, but full equality was not achieved. Black people in the South could now vote, for example, but they were still much poorer than whites. And fixing that kind of entrenched inequality, that was more complicated. Getting to full economic equality, that required not just giving everybody a fair chance, and that's what the Civil Rights Act did, but moving towards income redistribution, taking money from some people through taxation and giving it to other people through welfare benefits, and that was far more controversial. Most Americans are in favor of giving everybody a fair shot and the right to vote. Subsidizing others with your own taxes, however, that's unpopular in a country with a strong capitalist tradition where individualism and self-reliance are the ideal. All this led to conservative complaints in the 1970s about liberal overreach. Let's do an itemized list of these grievances. First, in the economic arena. As you remember, LBJ's Great Society was expensive with programs like Medicare and Medicaid, especially since Johnson insisted on doing welfare and going to the moon and fighting the Vietnam War, which were also expensive. When the government spends too much, there's a risk of inflation, prices going up, and sure enough, it was a big problem by the late 70s. Or rather, stagflation, since the economy overall was doing poorly in the 70s, not just high inflation, but poor GDP growth and high unemployment. The graph here shows you blue-collar wages and whether they went up or down over time, basically if U.S. workers got a raise that year. Notice how blue-collar wages have been pretty stagnant over the past few decades, or even went down in the 70s. There were different reasons for that, like inflation and the rise of automation, but many white, male, working-class people tended to blame social changes like civil rights and feminism. Essentially, the relative status of white men had gone down as the status of people of color and women went up, and the pie had to be shared more equally than in the past. The second consequence of high government spending was taxation, because all that money had to be raised from someone. This was also unpopular in a country like the US with a long tradition of small government, at least until the New Deal. This eventually led to a taxpayer revolt in the 70s. classic example would be California, where property taxes had gone steadily up in the 60s and 70s. So to all the penniless students out there who don't own real estate, this is how property taxes typically work. The government assesses how much your house is worth, and then taxes are based on that value, like, 1% of the value of your house to be paid each year, for example. In California, the state government kept raising that percentage to pay for social programs in the 60s and 70s, and also the value of real estate itself got more expensive, so homeowners got mad about their rising property tax bill. And those homeowners, they could actually do something about it. In California, voters can put referendums on the ballot. It's one of the legacies of the progressive era. So in 1978, the voters of California approved Prop 13, which prevented the state from raising property taxes by more than 2% a year or less than inflation. Similar ballot initiatives passed around the country in the 70s, which sent a strong signal to legislators everywhere that voters were unwilling to let government spending and taxation get any bigger than it was. In the foreign policy arena, conservatives were also mad because of all the diplomatic setbacks that we covered in the last lecture. As you remember, the U.S. lost control of Iran in 79, as well as Afghanistan and Nicaragua, and before that, the Vietnam War. So there was a sense that the U.S. was losing the Cold War with Russia. Conservatives attributed those setbacks to the soft, mushy policies of President Jimmy Carter, who wanted to promote human rights as a guiding principle of U.S. foreign policy. So conservatives wanted to return to a more hard-edged policy to defend core U.S. interests as opposed to, the human rights of other countries. In the class, we've noticed a divide between interventionists who want to be active overseas and isolationists who want to focus on America first. So far, the people who were interventionists in the class were often on the liberal side. Wilson, FDR, Truman, LBJ. These were the Democratic presidents who got us into World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Whereas Republicans like Harding or Coolidge in the 20s, they were more likely to be isolationists. Well, by the 1970s, the tables had turned because the young liberals who had opposed the Vietnam War, they now wanted to stop meddling in the affairs of other countries. So the Democratic Party was becoming more isolationist. Whereas modern conservatives, they were more willing to promote American national security and economic interests overseas, even if that meant invading a country here and there. And so they were now conservative interventionists, hawks or neocons, as they're called. But more than anything, conservatives were upset about how U.S. society had changed. Etymologically, the term conservatism means to conserve things the way they are. But the modern conservative movement might be better described as reactionary, in the sense that it wants to go back to an earlier period, pre-1960s, an idealized time when American society was going well for some people at least. Hence the slogan, "Making America Great Again," used by a recent politician who came of age in the 1950s. So what was wrong with U.S. society in the 70s, according to conservatives? Well, everything. There was a sense that society was going down the drain, that crime rates were up, that going for a night downtown in New York City was like going into a war zone, that you had race riots in Newark and Watts, and that the drug epidemic was out of control. It wasn't just a perception. Crime was up in the 70s. There were various reasons for it, but conservatives attributed the crime wave to the permissiveness of the 60s. Liberals had told young people to do whatever feels good, and U.S. society had gone to shreds as a result. Conservatives also complained that the progressive reforms of the 60s had gone too far when it came to race. When we talked about the Civil Rights Movement, I mentioned how racial segregation in schools was banned by the Supreme Court decision Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. There were a series of battles to put that decision in practice in Little Rock or the University of Alabama, but by and large, overall, a majority of the U.S. population was in favor of equal access to schools, and that battle was largely won by the late 60s. By that point, however, liberals realized that school integration was still incomplete for a simple fact. Black and white kids often lived in different neighborhoods, and since schools recruit locally, white and black kids were still going to different schools. Even after the Brown decision, just because there were school districts with a large black population and others that were mostly white. I live in Lake Charles, Louisiana, where the northern part of town tends to be black and the southern part tends to be white, and sure enough, schools in North Lake Charles are mostly black. It's not because our school board mandates racial separation in our schools. It's because the demographics of those two neighborhoods are different. That became worse in the 60s and 70s due to something called white flight. When a school in a diverse neighborhood became integrated, some white families preferred to move out to a lily white part of town rather than let their kids go to school with their black neighbors. So as white people left, that neighborhood became 100% black, and so did the school. So racial segregation in some ways got worse. So how do you fix a problem like black and white neighborhoods? That one is difficult. As a result, some courts mandated busing as a solution. Busing means to take black kids from a black neighborhood to a white school in a white part of town, or, which was more controversial, to take white kids from the white neighborhood to the black school in the black neighborhood. You could see how that would be very unpopular with white parents who then moved to a good school district on purpose as part of white flight, and then their kid had to wake up an hour earlier to take a bus back to the black high school, and that led to much violent popular backlash in places like Boston, Massachusetts. Another controversial racial policy was affirmative action. If you're not familiar with the concept, it means giving preferential treatment for members of minorities, such as African Americans, with a long history of discrimination against them. That might mean special quotas, universities, or maybe preferential hiring in the workplace. And the rationale for affirmative action is that poverty is often inherited. If your great-grandparents were slaves, then maybe you should get a little nudge to get you started up the economic ladder. Maybe you're from a family in rural Mississippi where nobody in your family ever graduated from high school, so you don't have access to tutors or prep schools. And it's going to be pretty hard to get a good score on the ACT and get admitted into an Ivy League school, even if you're smart. So a school might lower the required scores a bit for some disadvantaged groups to compensate for a long legacy of social inequality. So there is an argument to be made for affirmative action, but it's also a policy that was controversial, and still is, because it goes against a core U.S. principle that everyone is equal under the law. It replaces one kind of discrimination with another. On a more practical level, if you start giving more slots to one category of people, that means fewer slots for other, which is a major deal for competitive schools like Harvard University. Asian Americans are particularly mad about that policy. They feel that their kids worked hard to get into a top slot at Harvard, only to get passed over by a black student with lower scores, all of that because of slavery or forms of historical discrimination that Asian Americans are not responsible for, since many of them are recent immigrants. And by the way, there are also slots at Harvard University reserved for legacy students, i.e. the sons of rich alums who gave a ton of money to the school, which I also find to be completely unfair, but that's a different debate. I'm using Asian Americans at Harvard as an example because there is an ongoing lawsuit on the matter, but affirmative action is also controversial in the workplace. In academia, for example, there are a few people of color who teach, so hiring committees will go out of their way to hire qualified minority candidates, which is all well and good unless you're a white candidate competing for the same coveted teaching position and you get passed over. I'm speaking from experience here. Another argument used against affirmative action is based on the time frame, that the policy was justifiable in the 50s and 60s when you have a whole generation raised in the Jim Crow era, but ultimately past wrongs get corrected and there should be no reason to continue a policy of affirmative action forever if it is indeed effective. I'll let you ponder that debate on affirmative action and move on to another conservative complaint that the media, TV and such, is dominated by people who went to college, who live in California and New York City, who tend to be more liberal than average, and whenever they cover an event, whether it's a riot in the streets or the Vietnam War, those journalists always pick the liberal viewpoint, liberal bias in the media. And there was some truth to that. In the 1972 election, George McGovern was the candidate for the Democratic side. Very liberal, very anti-war, a darling of the media. But when the ballots were counted that year, the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon, who was hated by the press, won in a landslide, hitting that clearly the views of the media did not match the views of the quote-unquote silent majority. So, liberal bias in the media. That was another conservative grievance. Last but not least, an issue that became central in the cultural wars was the legalization of abortion by the Supreme Court decision Roe v. Wade in 1973. Feminists, they saw it as a major victory. This way, women had control over their reproductive rights. But for religious people, abortion was murder, a horrible sin, and it had to be opposed no matter what. These are called single-issue voters, voters who might agree with Democrats on healthcare or foreign policy or education or what have you, but will always vote Republican due to the one issue that is paramount for them, in that case, abortion. Which means, incidentally, that religious voters who traditionally voted on both sides of the aisle have become more associated with conservative circles in recent decades, especially white evangelicals. Notice that many of the conservative grievances I mentioned involve race and religion, which are combustible topics, which is why we speak of wedge issues or the cultural wars. It's one thing to disagree with a fellow citizen over tax rates or foreign policy, but it's much more personal when one side thinks that the other is a baby killer. So don't be surprised if politics become more bitter and personal, as we'll see in a second. So here are all the main conservative complaints. Taxes are too damn high because of welfare handouts. The U.S. is in decline internationally, and liberals are trying to re-engineer U.S. society in a way that's gone too far. It's now time to move on to slide number 2. What do you do about all these problems? What is the modern conservative agenda to fix all these issues? Before we get there, it might be good to pause the video for a second and ask yourself what traditionally defined conservatism. We had a whole lecture on Gilded Age conservatives and also on the Republicans of the 20s and then also on Eisenhower in the 1950s. So what did it mean to be conservative back then? Well, as you recall, traditional conservatism was all about small government, low taxes, low government spending, a small army, isolationism overseas, and free enterprise at home. Some of this has endured in the modern conservative agenda, which also advocates tax cuts, especially for the rich. That's called supply side or trickle-down economics. Remember that Gilded Age conservatives like Andrew Carnegie were against high taxes on the rich. In fact, there was no federal income tax at all back then. Those people thought that rich people were superior human beings genetically, who should keep what they earn and maybe later on finance some charity if they wished. That was Carnegie's gospel of wealth. Moving to the 20s, the Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Mellon, lowered the top rates for the income tax on the belief that if you cut taxes for the rich, they would invest those savings in their business because they were entrepreneurs, and so GDP growth would rise, so would employment rates, and the wealth would trickle down all the way to employees at the bottom. The rising tide would lift all boats. Well, moving on to today, modern conservatives make the same arguments through the Laffer Curve, L-A-F-F-E-R, which I'm showing you right now. The vertical y-axis shows how much the government is taxing as a percentage of income, from 0 to 100%. While the horizontal x-axis shows how much the government is actually getting in revenue in billions of dollars. Normally, government revenue tends to grow up as tax rates go up. If the income tax rate is, 10% of income, and then the government raises that figure to 20% of income, obviously there will be more taxes coming in, and the government revenue will go up. That's what you see going on in the lower part of the graph. But that economist who designed the curve, Laffer, added something else. If taxes keep going up to 50, 60, 70, 80% of income, at some point they become so prohibitive that people don't want to work anymore because the government takes more and more of what they make. So what's the point of getting up in the morning just to pay more taxes to the government? So when taxes are too high, people ended up working less, and the government might be taking 80% of somebody's income, but it's a smaller income to begin with, and so the resulting revenue for the government will go down, which is the reason why on that graph you see a bell curve, where at some point the revenue for the government goes down as taxes reach prohibitive levels, and eventually the revenue for the government declines to 0. If you tax people 100% of their income, they will not work at all, and there will be no wealth to tax. Conservatives, they love the Laffer curve because that justified cutting taxes for the rich, while claiming that such tax cuts would be revenue neutral for the government. Let me explain. Let's say you go from a point high in the curve where you tax people 80% of their income and they don't work much as a result, and then you cut the tax rate to only 30% of their income. Well, those people will work more now that they can keep the bulk of their income, And even though the government is only taking 30% of that income, it is a much larger income to begin with, and the total revenue obtained by the government remains the same. So win-win. Lower taxes for the rich, and then somehow the government's budget remains balanced, which is another traditional conservative goal. So that Laffer Curve, which is theoretical, I want to emphasize, that became the justification for various rounds of tax cuts from the 1980s forward. Reagan and other conservatives believed that you could cut taxes for the rich and yet somehow remain fiscally responsible at the same time. Also, in the economic arena, conservatives embrace pro-business policies and deregulation. And there's nothing new there. That was also true in the Gilded Age. The only major change in recent years has been the focus on undoing environmental regulations passed by the EPA. So the modern conservative movement is very close to the oil and gas industry, and it has opposed attempts to curb global warming, or even opposed the notion that global warming is real to begin with. So the modern conservative movement tends to be anti-science, not just on the issue of global warming, but biology in general as well. The religious branch of the conservative movement actively opposes the teaching of evolution in public schools, for example. More recently, during the COVID-19 outbreak, many conservatives denounced the pandemic as a hoax, or claimed that masks didn't help, or refused to be vaccinated. In the more extreme version, you get to the cuckoo conspiratorial wing of the modern conservative movement, which claimed that the moon landings were fake, that the earth is flat, and that the government operates secret concentration camps or poisons you with contrails from airplanes or fluoride in your water. That anti-scientific bent is a change for the 19th century version of conservatism, which was in favor of science, especially Darwinism, but that branch is getting more dominant every year. All right, let's move away from economics to issue number 2, diplomacy. The Democratic Party had traditionally been interventionist, which meant that it was anti-communist during the Cold War. We saw how Truman started the containment policy in the Cold War and then joined the Korean War, and how JFK was obsessed with Cuba, or LBJ dramatically amped up U.S. involvement in Vietnam. But in the 70s, many people in the Democratic Party turned sharply against the Vietnam War, or the use of force overseas in general, or even the army and the police because of war crimes committed by the army in Vietnam, as well as police abuse at the Chicago Convention in '68. So as a result, the Republican Party was able to refashion itself as a one and only patriotic party, which would stand up to Russian communists and support the army and the police no matter what. Law and order, that became the new buzzword. A flashpoint in that regard was the issue of the American flag, which some radicals would burn during demonstrations. Republicans tried to ban that practice, but the Supreme Court chose to support the First Amendment instead. Burning the flag, however offensive that might be, that was the way, according to the Supreme Court, that people expressed themselves. And so the government could not curtail free speech, even if it was offensive. And that issue resurfaced a few years back when Colin Kaepernick, you may remember, he took a knee during the national anthem to protest police brutality. His was a very respectful form of protest. He was taking a knee, not the same as burning a flag, but that allowed the conservative side to again complain that liberals are traitors who hate America. Cutting taxes for the rich, supporting big business, deregulation, all of these are conservative policies going back to the Gilded Age. What's different with the modern conservative movement is its emphasis as well on cultural wedge issues like flag burning, as well as banning affirmative action, promoting prayers in schools, or reversing the Roe v. Wade decision on abortion. That emphasis on the cultural wars, that's what defines the modern conservative movement and separates it from its early 20th century predecessors. Notice that many of these issues, from free speech to abortion, eventually involve the Supreme Court. And as a result, because justices are named by the president and then confirmed by the Senate, and because there are only 9 justices and they're appointed for life, each new Supreme Court vacancy has become like a life and death situation nowadays, where liberals and conservatives, they think that the whole future of the cultural wars is at stake. For conservatives, pushing wedge issues has been an effective way to mobilize single-issue voters, such as pro-life evangelicals or Catholics, who might not agree with other elements of the conservative agenda, like tax cuts, but can be reliably expected to show up to vote because they want a president who will appoint a new justice who will overturn Roe v. Wade. The other big group of single-issue voters in the modern conservative movement would be Second Amendment gun enthusiasts. The U.S. has an unusually high death rate from gun violence, not just from famous high-profile mass shootings, but also from suicide and domestic violence and accidents involving kids. Limiting who has access to guns, as well as banning certain military-style weapons like AR-15s, that used to be broadly embraced by Republicans and Democrats alike until the 1970s, but somehow this is a non-starter in the modern conservative movement. And I must confess that the stark refusal to accept any form of gun control, even after horrible events like the Sandy Hook massacre or the Parkland massacre, this has always baffled me. I understand why some people would be repelled by abortion. I get it. But I really don't understand the compulsive need for a young man to own 20 assault rifles, unless he's compensating for some inadequacies in his anatomy. Anyway, add guns to the list of wedge issues that are central to the modern conservative movement. Those wedge issues in turn created a dichotomy in the Republican Party between the more traditional country club Republicans, the kind of businessmen who just wanted to pay fewer taxes, but otherwise didn't care if their daughter got an abortion, and then the single-issue Republicans who were often less affluent, but who would vote conservative to support law and order, or the flag, or guns, or unborn babies. These working-class voters, they used to be solidly Democratic, because Democrats had been the party of unions since the New Deal. But many of them eventually switched to become Reagan Democrats, as they were called. So you have a duality of the Republican Party. On one side, country club rich Republicans, and then cultural wars, poor Republicans on the other side. And that creates an internal tension between working-class Republicans who want a continuation of the big welfare program that they benefit from, like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, whereas all these small government country club conservatives, they want to slash these programs, and they want to cut taxes for the rich. And there's a paradox with the modern conservative movement, whose supporters are often poor, and yet elects very rich people who want tax cuts for themselves. Here's a map showing you which states are richer per capita and which ones are poor. Counterintuitively, the richer states, like New York or California on the coast, they're also nowadays the more liberal ones, while poorer states like Louisiana or Mississippi are also ultra-conservative. And that's also true if you zoom in further. In Texas, big cities like Austin and Houston, which are economically dynamic, they tend to vote Democratic, while poor rural areas vote Republican. That creates an odd situation where rich states pay more in taxes than they get back from the federal government, because they make more money to begin with. And yet they vote for progressive candidates who want to tax and spend even more. And meanwhile, poor states get a lot more than they pay in taxes because they have plenty of Medicare and Medicaid recipients, and yet they vote for conservative officials who want to slash those welfare programs. Americans on both sides of the aisle seem to be voting against their economic interests. I find that interesting. If you are interested in this issue, I would recommend reading a book called What's the Matter with Kansas, which asks why farmers and poor whites in Kansas, who get a bunch of government aid, also vote reliably Republican, which is quite a remarkable turnaround when you remember that Kansas was ground zero for the Populist Party back in the 80s and 90s. According to the author of that book, Thomas Frank, there's a kind of a con game going on where one half of the Republican Party, the country club tax cut part, uses the other half, the anti-abortion, pro-gun half, to get the votes, get a majority in Congress, pass what they really want, which is tax cuts for the rich, and then make no progress whatsoever on the cultural issues that the base wants, so has to save those issues for the next election and get voters all riled up so they can show up to vote again. I'll let you make up your mind on the matter. As far as the class is concerned, what you need to remember is that the modern conservative movement borrows elements from its predecessors, like tax cuts and deregulation, while adding a number of wedge issues that are a product of the cultural wars of the 60s and 70s, like abortion and guns and law and order. Well, will that agenda be enough to get conservatives elected to the White House and Congress? And when they do get elected, what will they actually implement? What will be the effect of these conservative policies? Well, I know that today was supposed to be our last lecture in the class, but there's a whole lot more to say about modern U.S. politics, so I'm going to pause here, take a break, get a glass of water, and save the rest for a second video. This is an important topic, and I don't want to rush it. Oh well. and see you next time when we'll finish a lecture and delve into the recent political history of the US.
Au revoir and goodbye.